Good afternoon. My name is Bob Armstrong. I'm director of the MIT Energy Initiative, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this afternoon's Mighty seminar given by Dr. Joanna Moody, who's the research program manager for the Mobility Systems Center, one of Mighty's low carbon energy centers. Today, she's going to be talking about valuing private car ownership and use in the United States. I first got to know Joanna through the Insights into Mobility, a study that Mighty conducted over the last 3 or 4 years, and which was released in the late fall of 2019. Joanna, in that study, was one of the lead researchers looking at private car ownership in the US and abroad. And it was a very insightful researcher. We're really delighted to have her staying on with us at Mighty in her current role as research program manager. In that role, she's also one of the co-PIs on one of the center's first projects. And I think you'll find that she is really insightful into issues around mobility in the US and elsewhere, whether it's private car ownership or other modes of transportation. Now, before I turn it over to Joanne, I just wanted to highlight a few upcoming Mighty events to make sure you have those on your calendar. December 3rd at 11 a.m., we have Professor Sigan Henry giving a seminar looking at some high temperature technologies for low carbon systems. On December 8th and 9th is the United States C3E, or Women in Clean Energy Symposium and Awards, which we do in collaboration with the Department of Energy in the US, the Stanford Precourt Institute for Energy, and the Texas A&M Energy Institute. Normally that's a closed event, but this year in consideration of COVID-19, it is an event open to the public, and you can get information on that and other events from Mighty's events page on our website. So with that brief introduction, let me turn it over to Joanna. I don't want to take time away from her. She's going to be the interesting one to hear this afternoon. Joanna?
All right, thank you so much, Bob, for the introduction, and I'm really looking forward to participating and listening into the upcoming webinars as well. And as Bob introduced, I'm the Research Program Manager for MIT Energy Initiative's Low Carbon Energy Center focused on mobility systems, and today I'm going to be presenting research that I've been working with a number of colleagues on, looking at how we can value private car ownership and use in the United States and some implications of what we've been finding. And so I'll just dive right into just some of the motivations behind why we are looking at what we are looking at. So really, the first motivation here is a persistent reality of car ownership and use in the United States. According to the US Bureau of Transportation Statistics, over 90% of US households own at least one car, and 91% of adults around the country commute to work using private car. And this is despite the fact that there's been a growing narrative around the fact that a car is an underutilized asset. In fact, the average car in the US is parked 95% of the time. It's only in use 5% of its lifetime. And the fact that it is expensive. There's been a lot of discussion around the fact that average households spend over $9,000 a year on a car, with the most recent AAA and Edmunds estimates putting it at around $9,200. And there's also hope for demographic changes and new technology to potentially supplant the existing car ownership and use paradigm. And so by new technologies, I'm talking about things like ride hailing, the Uber or Lyft on-demand car services, and the broader idea of mobility as a service, or a package of all of these different transportation options that you could sort of subscribe to, like a cable package of television channels that would then provide you the mobility you need, and you would no longer need to rely on owning and using a private car. But we know that people are still using and owning private cars. And so one question that we have here is, how can we explain this sort of paradox? The fact that cars are expensive, they're underutilized, there are now growing number of alternatives to the private car, and yet we still are owning and using cars at a really high rate. And one of the common narratives that has come forward in the literature is the fact that consumers underestimate the cost of car ownership and use. That $9,200 number, if you ask people about how much they spend, they generally way underestimate that number. But there's an alternative explanation that we're going to sort of posit and test in this study, and that is that consumers derive value from car ownership and use that's greater than its costs. And particularly, some of that value is what we're going to call option value. And this is sort of reframing that idea of the car as an underutilized asset that sits unused, and talking about the fact that that car is there for me anytime I need it. Even when I'm not taking that trip for 95% of the time, I could be using it at a moment's notice. And that flexibility, that convenience provides value to consumers. And so we want to understand what are the implications for growing interest in mobility as a service, as a potential transition for private car ownership to shared multimodal mobility, and what is this value of the car? What are the pieces of it? Can we unpack it and understand its implications for these new services? And so specifically, we're going to look at it started out as 2 research questions, evolved into 3 research questions. So the first research question is, what is the value of the personal car? Can we just get a numeric number for this? Do we know how much people value a car on average? And then also, can we separate this value into the value of the trips that that car makes, that 5% of the time, and then the value of owning that car separate from its use? And then we want to understand if mobility options other than the private car were ubiquitous and had high quality service, how might that change the attractiveness of car ownership and use in the future? And given our current situation, and we've revised and sort of adopted an additional research question into this, which is, what is the impact of the current pandemic and COVID-19 on the value of the personal car? What can we learn or sort of from this interruption to our general day-to-day life and day-to-day use of cars? And so I'm going to present results from a major online survey that was collected from June through July of 2020. And so the first thing I need to acknowledge here is that this survey was conducted during the first wave of COVID in many US cities, and in particular in the 4 metropolitan areas that we studied. And so we collected data through a professional panel company, Qualtrics, in 4 metropolitan areas: Washington, DC, Chicago, Seattle, and Dallas, Texas. And these 4 cities each have about 1,000 respondents per city for a total of 4,000 respondents. And they were chosen to capture different geographic regions, different levels of car dependence measured by both the typical share of people who use private cars for their commute, as well as household car ownership. And then we also, for reasons that I think will become clear, wanted to make sure that we were looking at least fairly established ride-hailing markets across these 4 cities. And these samples were quota controlled to be representative of the population in each metro area in terms of age, household income, and household car ownership. And so I'm going to give our main findings outright, and then I'm going to walk through each one of these in turn, give you the details, the evidence from our survey for making these claims, and then also talk a little bit about the implication of each of these findings. And so let's just go ahead and start with our first main finding, which is, what is the value of the car? And on average, we found that private cars are valued more than they cost in the United States, and the majority of that value comes from ownership rather than use. And so how did we come to this conclusion and actually measure these numbers? So first, we implemented a discrete binary choice experiment. It involves asking respondents 2 option choices, and they look something like this example. So given a scenario, would you prefer to, 1, keep access to your transportation mode and receive no money, or give up access to your transportation mode for a year and receive a given compensation amount? And we are going to vary the compensation amount that each respondent sees. They answer 4 of these choices for each scenario. And then we also have multiple scenarios that cover valuation of different transportation modes, particularly looking at ride hailing, car ownership, and car use. And we're going to repeat, and we repeated this for both respondents, asking them to recall a typical year of travel behavior pre-COVID-19, so 2019, and then also about their travel during the month of June during COVID-19. And to give you a little bit more detail about what scenarios we actually asked these choices in, the first scenario was, given all of your travel needs and options currently in a typical year, choose whether to give up access to ride hailing for the compensation or not. And from the answers to these repeated choice questions and varying that compensation amount, we can derive the value of ride hailing access. Scenario 2 is, given all of your travel needs and options in a typical year, choose whether to give up access to your primary car. And so here, we're getting the value of car ownership and use, because we're asking individuals to value their car based on the fact that they already own it and the typical use and the trips that they already make by that car. And then scenario 3 is where we can start to try and get a sense of separating the value of ownership from use. And so in this scenario, we say, you have new, completely free access to a ubiquitously high quality ride hailing service that can serve every single trip that you currently make by your primary vehicle without any additional inconvenience. And so the idea here is, we are replacing your private car use with another car-based mode, but you no longer own it. So we're trying to take that use out of the equation. And then we ask, how much would you need to be compensated to give up access to your car? And this is trying to get at, what is the value of car ownership only? Once we've replaced all of the trips that you currently make by car, how much do you still need to be compensated to give up that car? And from this analysis, we can estimate a logistic regression model where that dependent variable is which of those two options you chose. Did you choose to keep your car, or did you choose to give up that car for a given compensation amount? And we're going to estimate first a base model, which is just, we're going to predict your choice based on a random intercept, so that accounts for heterogeneity across the individuals in our sample, and then the compensation amount. And from this, we can calculate what they call the median willingness to accept compensation, or WTAC. So you may see this acronym on a couple of other slides. It's a willingness to accept compensation. And what we're going to do is we're going to say it's that compensation amount at which the median person is equally likely to give up or keep their car for a year, or ride hailing, depending on which scenario you're in. And from this, we can get a point estimate of how much does the median individual in our sample of 4,000 people across 4 metro areas in the US, how much value do they ascribe to these different modes? And so for the ride hailing scenario, we get a point estimate of $123. I'm also providing 95% confidence intervals for these numbers, so you can get a sense of sort of how much range we have around these predictions. And then for car ownership and use together, we find that the estimate is over $11,000. And so to compare, right, I gave early on in this presentation the number of $9,200 a year is the average cost. So what we're finding is that the median willingness to accept compensation, the sort of measure of value of the private car, exceeds the cost on average across our respondents. And then if we only look at the scenario where we consider car ownership, we find that around $6,500 of that total value is ascribable to ownership. And that's actually 58% of the value, the total value of that car in scenario 2 comes from ownership. And then only 42%, the remaining 42%, are ascribed to car use by taking the difference between scenarios 3 and 2. And there's a lot of different parts that make up this value that we're measuring. And so we do want to understand what are qualitatively some of the pieces, the components of this value. And so we asked individuals to select the top 3 reasons for why they may be reluctant to give up their car. And what you're going to see is actually there's a fairly large breakpoint here where the top 3 options are very commonly selected. And there are others that matter, but these top 3 clearly show that they are the main reasons why people select they're reluctant to give up their car. And really, a lot of these have to do with this option value. It's about control over your schedule, the certainty and reliability of being able to use the car at any time, and the flexibility that the car provides. That's not to say that this value doesn't also include things like comfort, safety and security, privacy that the car provides. Those are also very important reasons what people give. But really, these top three reasons are all about this option value. And this is about, again, the value of car ownership, not just the trips that that car makes. And so our finding here is that on average, private cars are valued more than they cost, and the majority of the value comes from ownership rather than use. There are a couple of implications for this finding. First, people are not irrationally buying cars. Even if people systematically underestimate car costs, we're comparing to an actual estimate of car ownership in the US, the $9,200. People still on average derive more value than that. And if we want to provide a real alternative to private car ownership and use, we really need to understand these multifaceted reasons for why people want cars. And the value of the car is really not its use. So we can't just focus on cost per mile or a trip-by-trip cost comparison across different modes. We really need to understand the car more broadly and the flexibility and the sort of certainty that it brings to individuals, and how we might be able to find an alternative to the car that can provide a similar level of value. And now we're going to break these findings down to the individual level. And here we find that individuals who travel less by car and more by alternative modes are more willing to give up private car ownership and use. And the value of private car ownership and use is lower for urban areas, no matter which city we're in of the 4 cities that we selected. And so how are we going to come to these findings? So we use that same base model, but now we're going to add covariates or characteristics of the individual, sociodemographics, household composition, how many cars the individual owns, their typical travel behavior, and variables on the city and urban environment. And so we're going to include those additional predictors. And then what we get is we solve for each individual's indifference compensation. So instead of having an average result like I just provided, now we have a willingness to accept compensation or a value for car ownership and use for every single individual that accounts for their unique sociodemographics and environment. And then what we can do is we can compare again the value that an individual ascribes to a car to their cost. And so here we have the estimated value of the car from scenario 2. So this is the value of car ownership and use combined. And here is the self-reported cost for the household. So first, what you're going to find is that, yes, people are underestimating the cost in our sample, but 80% of individuals in our sample find that they give us a value, or we estimate a value higher than the cost they report. Even if you assume that every single one of these individuals underestimates the cost of their car by 50%, which would put you at this y equals 1.5 line, 75% of people still value the car more than it costs. And this 50% comes from literature. So we know that typically people underestimate the cost of their car by about 50%. But even if you account for that bias, we still have 75% of our individuals that derive more value from their car than it costs. And then we can also look at the impact of the different covariates that we've included in the model on willingness to give up car ownership and use. So I'm only going to show the variables that were statistically significant, and I've organized them based on the sign of their coefficient. And so here are the variables that increase the likelihood to give up your car, and here are the variables that decrease the likelihood to give up your car. So as we see, individuals who are older and are white are not willing to give up their car, whereas males, those who are Hispanic, and those who have a disability that makes it difficult for them to use a vehicle are more likely to give up their car. And here I want to focus on this typical travel behavior. And so really this gets at the fact that those who rely more on their car, less likely to give it up. Those who have quality alternatives that they can actually use for trips on a day-to-day basis, whether it's ride hailing, public transit, or walking or biking, each of those increases likelihood to give up the car. And then we also see that being in an urban zip code, apologies, this should actually be in this side. So increasing to an urban zip code increases the likelihood to give up the car. The more urban you are, the lower your value of car ownership and use. So here are the individual values of car ownership and use for those respondents whose home zip code is in a rural R, suburban S, or urban neighborhood. And you can see that both the median and the mean drastically decrease here as we get more urban. So what are some of the implications of these findings? It does mean that there are things we can do to try and change or affect the value that people get from their car. And there are some of these that are more medium term, and there are some of these that are more long-term interventions. So first, the transitioning from car dependence is really going to require the provision of high quality, high value alternatives to the car. And in the medium term, some of that might be service and infrastructure improvements that support public transit, walking and biking, and also employer programs like subsidized transit. All of these variables we found were increased the likelihood that the individual would give up their car. And then longer term, we know that land use planning matters for shaping any transition from car dependence. And so as you get more dense mixed use in an urban environment, then the value of the car decreases significantly. So then the second finding is related to this question of what is the impact of COVID-19 on these values? And so I mentioned that we asked these same choices with the same scenarios, and we asked people for a typical year pre-COVID, 2019, and we also asked them for a month during COVID. And this is a fairly early on in the COVID pandemic during the initial wave of cases in June or early July. And here is what we find. So this column is the estimated willingness to accept compensation for a month of COVID. This is the values I showed previously for a year, but divided by 12. So now we're on a generally month-to-month comparison. And what you're going to find is that the value of ride hailing wasn't really significantly impacted. The value of cars increased substantially, and that almost all of that is due to increased value of car ownership, not use. So the valuation of the car is 3 times higher during COVID than it was pre-COVID, and almost all of that value comes from ownership. And you can see actually the use value is pretty much equivalent, both pre and during COVID. And so I think that there are a couple of different implications for this finding. Car ownership is in some ways a security blanket. And the more risk averse we are, or the more uncertain our travel needs are, then the more attractive this option value of car ownership is. The fact that that car is there for me if I need it to get to the emergency room, to make a trip when I'm afraid to take public transit. There are many reasons why this might amplify the option value of car ownership compared to most other multimodal or shared modes of travel. And I also think that the ownership value is interesting in that people are not using their ownership they're not using their car that frequently during COVID-19. Just the pie of travel, the amount of trips that people are making shrunk significantly. And so really the majority of value during this time has come from ownership. And then the final finding from this study is that the value of car ownership in use is orders of magnitude higher than the value of other transportation options. And so we saw that to some extent with the single binary discrete choice questions that I just presented. We saw that the ride hailing value was something like $123 for a typical year, whereas the car was $11,000. We also did another type of choice experiment. In this case, it's called best worst scaling. And in these questions, individuals are given 3 options, and they're asked not to choose one, but to rank the best and the worst option to give up for a year. And from each of these three sets, you get one mobility good, one non-mobility good, and one monetary amount. And each respondent answered 10 choices where these mobility goods, other goods, and monetary amounts were randomized. And in this case, because there are 10 questions each with a best and a worst choice, we didn't repeat it twice for pre-COVID and COVID. We just randomized half the sample into one and half the sample into the other. So for the next chart, which are the results of this best worst scaling, this is for a random half of the sample, not the full sample. And so these are the results just for a typical year. And here, what best worst scaling allows you to do is create a ranking based on, in this case, disutility, because we're asking everyone to give it up for a year, of the importance of these different goods and their monetary amounts. And here what we see is that, again, access to personal car is valued at greater than $10,000 per year. This is normalized so that $100 per year is zero right here. So we see that pretty much every other urban mobility option that we included in these questions was valued at less than $100 a year. And that includes car rental or car sharing, pooled and exclusive ride hailing, buses, bikes, trains, and biker scooter share. And so what are the potential implications of this? First is that for the majority of US residents, there are few real substitutes for the private car in the mobility space. And I think that this really poses a challenge for future urban mobility systems in finding the right package of alternatives that together provide value that rivals that of the car. If you take all of these together and you add them up and each of them is worth less than $10,000, they don't add up to the value that we're currently seeing people ascribe to car ownership and use. And so we need to figure out, how do we design a mobility as a service package or a multimodal system of urban mobility that really can compete, where the sum of the parts, the value of the sum of the parts is greater than the value of each of those parts exclusively. And that is a challenge that we still are working through and need to address from both the research angle, from the operations angle, and also from the policymaking angle. And so with that, I want to leave up again our main findings and open it up for some question and answer and discussion.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That was great. So we already have a number of questions coming in. Encourage the audience, if you have questions, to submit that through the Q&A button in the bottom center of your screens. Now, let me start with a question about, in one of your early slides, you had a $C variable. And the question was, what did you set that variable to, and how did you set it? Is it based on respondents' income or respondent car value?
Right. So the choices of C were randomized across individuals, but they did not depend on the respondents' other sociodemographics. So it wasn't based on income and it wasn't based on the car value. The total spread, or the different options that were randomized for each individual, was determined through both literature review and understanding of what is the cost, but also through pilot studies. So I didn't show the results here, but we had a pilot study with around 2,000 respondents. We could look at what was the error that we were getting in our estimation based on the values that we provided. We looked at how it was correlated with the respondents' income and other variables. And that's one of the reasons why we also include the models where we're controlling for respondents' income and other sociodemographics when we're looking at the individual specific results.
Good, thank you. So another comment was that it would be interesting to price an option on the value of ownership. So this goes at the COVID, non-COVID data you showed. Are you saying that the valuation of ownership increased during COVID, and that would represent people who want to have the option of being more independent? So it's a form of preparedness. Is that how you interpret that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, so first, these were only asked of individuals who currently own a car, because the way that the choices are framed is, would you be willing to give up your car for a given compensation amount? And so these are individuals who already have the option of a car. And really, I think that this is coming down to a couple of factors, this finding of COVID. The first is that we're in a time where it's really uncertain and where we maybe don't trust the other alternatives that are available to us, even in an urban and a multimodal environment, as much as we trust our car. And whether that trust is misplaced or that fear of other services is misplaced is sort of beyond the scope of this, but that there is a security, a sense of ownership and control over having your own vehicle that provides a lot more value to individuals. And then just the fact that if I needed to get somewhere in a hurry, that car is there for me and I don't need to worry about it. I just jump in and it takes me where I need to go.
Yeah. So there was a question about whether or not you've looked at a really dense urban environment where a car is actually a disadvantage, or at least many people could perceive it as a disadvantage. Say, to an area like San Francisco, where it's really hard to park or really expensive to afford a parking place. Think of Boston, for example. And so the question is whether there people might find ride hailing apps more advantageous, or walking well worth it to just give up a car.
Yeah. So there are a couple of ways that you could answer this question, so I'll give a couple. First is that we have looked at this same chart, rural, urban, and suburban split for the value of ride hailing from the other scenario, and we do find that increases as you get more urban. So it is true that there is variation here, and as you're more urban, you do value you value ride hailing more and you value cars less. Here we're seeing that the value of the car drops when you're in a more urban zip code. Now, about with the city, actually, these models don't show it here, but each of these models included city dummies for the 4 cities that we chose to study. And those are very different in urban form. We have Dallas, Texas, which is an extremely car dependent, very high car ownership and use city. And we have Chicago, which has a fairly robust transit system, Washington, DC, and Seattle, somewhere sort of in the middle. And what we find is that whether or not the zip code is urban is statistically significant, which city you're in is not. So that there is actually no statistically significant difference in the trends that we're seeing, depending on which of these 4 cities you're in. What matters is where you are within that metropolitan area. Are you on the outskirts or are you in the center? And that's true for value of ride hailing, value of cars.
So within your COVID study, you picked a month, I think it said on your slide, of COVID compared with to pre-COVID.
Yeah.
The question is can you tease out of that? Do you have enough resolution to say something about impacts during COVID on choices or preferences, given that mass transit services in many urban areas are being cut back? This is partly a personal question because I've just gotten notice of some local meetings in the west suburbs, Lexington, where I live, for example, where bus service is being cut. Well, a discussion of whether or not those services would be cut back. And at least pre-COVID, I never drove to MIT. I always commuted by the T, and so won't have a choice if that option is eliminated.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't have the results here, but one of the things that we do as well in the COVID results is we have them broken down again by the sociodemographics like you see here. And in that case, we actually asked questions of both what is your typical travel behavior pre-COVID and also what mode are you using now during COVID, to allow for the fact that someone may be traditionally a public transit user, but because of multiple reasons, whether it's cuts to the service or the fact that MIT made parking free, for employees during this time, they've switched. I wouldn't say that that is the focus of our study. We really were wanting to understand what are these long-term trends in terms of how people ascribe value to car ownership and use. It happened and we needed to recognize it and understand what its impacts might be. But I don't think that we, in this survey, have really unpacked all of the different factors that are going to be influencing this. But a very small plug for Mobility Systems Center, which is the research group or consortium in which this project is being undertaken. And there is another project there looking specifically at how COVID impacts public transit and shared mobility, with a particular emphasis on disaggregating those results across different types of user groups and areas within cities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So there's a question about the downward sloping demand curve you showed. And the question is, wouldn't the average willingness to accept compensation exceed the marginal willingness to accept compensation, with the latter, the marginal cost reflecting actual costs?
So I believe this question is about this graph. So I think that this is again where we are trying to understand and try and unpack the importance of understanding ownership and use value separately. If you're talking about the marginal cost of car ownership, not the marginal value, but we'll talk about the marginal cost, that is fairly negligible for most individuals. When you go to get in your car and take a trip, you are not thinking about the amount of gas that you're going to have to pay for maybe a week later when you're filling up the tank. If you have a toll or parking, then maybe you feel it immediately for that trip. But most of the time, most individuals face a fairly low marginal cost of driving a car. And so a lot of people say that is one of these factors, and then also that ownership costs are underestimated. The point here is that the value of the car is way more than just its use. And in fact, most of it comes from its ownership. And so when we're talking about a per mile basis, it's really maybe not the right metric to be, or marginal, it's really maybe not the right metric to be talking about this cost versus value comparison, that it's maybe more important to talk about this over a month or over a lifestyle of travel and how it's met by different options.
So here's a question that I'll veer a little off topic here in the sense that you were focused on the U.S. Yeah. But of course, a lot of the big urban areas in the world are being built outside of the U.S. And the question is whether or not you've done research or that's on the agenda on how these results may differ if I go to some other part of the world, maybe China, for example, or India. Do you see similar willingness to accept compensation curves there, or is it universal? I mean, universal.
The short answer is this is the first time we've ever seen someone quantify the value of car ownership and use, and so far we've only done it for the US. So these results are fairly hot off the presses, and unfortunately we don't have it, although we would love to expand it to other places. The US is in some ways fairly anomalous in its saturation level and sort of in its motorization level. Those numbers that I showed, over 90% of households owning a car, over 90% of adults commuting by car, are fairly high even for developed and fairly motorized countries. When we're talking about rapidly motorizing countries that don't yet have such a mature car market, we could very well see some differences. Other research that I've done as part of the Insights into Future Mobility study and other work within my portfolio has looked a lot at how people attribute social status and personal image to their car, at what I call car pride. And actually what we found is that car pride is highest in rapidly motorizing and developing countries. And so the car is very much an aspirational good, and that people ascribe a lot of social status, personal image to being able to own and use a car, and that may be part of this value equation that we haven't been talking about in a lot of these contexts.
So is there an impact on that, the pride, car pride,
Mhm.
on an impact from advertising? So
Um,
I know the U.S. best since I live here, but there are lots of ads on TV, online about cars and extolling the luxury and the comfort and so on. Are there similar marketing campaigns in other countries? Are they different? Does it matter to car pride? How much effort goes into pushing cars?
yeah, absolutely. We're getting slightly off topic here, but I'm happy to talk car pride as much
Oh
as
no.
people want to. Um, and and really, I think that first is that car manufacturing globally is one of the top 5 industries in terms of marketing expenditure. For every car sold, they spend on the order of thousands of dollars on marketing per vehicle. If you actually take the total amount that they use on branding, marketing, advertising, and divide by the number of vehicles that they sell. So this is not something that's organic or inherent. It's definitely something that has been shaped over many years of advertising, and something that I often argue is sort of that public transit and other alternatives to private car are losing a marketing war that they're not engaging in. Because often public transit systems, with a few exceptions, really lack a clear brand and a way that they connect the service and the mobility that they provide to individuals in the way that a private car does.
Good. Thank you. Sorry for taking you off track.
All right.
So there's a question about how age relates to the likelihood of giving up a car. Right? So do you see trends, say at younger stage of life, adulthood, are you less or more likely to give up a car? Maybe you have fewer children that you have to drive around to different activities as you get to middle age. Are you more willing to give up a car? So observations about maybe generational impacts or age impacts.
Yeah, so those are 2 very different things. So age
Yep.
impacts and generational impacts. So there's very clear evidence that the your needs for a car and your consumption of cars, both in terms of car ownership and use, do vary by age. Often it increases as you go from young adult through middle age and sort of peaks at 50 or 60, depending on sort of where you are in your career, et cetera. And then as you age beyond that and maybe retire, your family moves away, then car ownership does tend to decrease a little bit. So it is a non-linear trend. In our models, what we're doing is just looking first at the linear effect, and we do find that willingness to give up your car decreases with age. And so that sort of follows that main trajectory, although there may be a drop off at higher ages. Now, when it comes to generational effects, there was a really strong hope that the real differences that we were seeing in terms of car ownership and car use among millennials was something that might persist and may be sort of an attitude or a preference change across generations. And there's some really good research, some of which is within the Mobility Initiative's Insights into Future Mobility work by Chris Knittel, that has really debunked this. That if you control for the difference in marriage age, in income, in life stages, millennials really don't look very different from other generations, and this doesn't seem to be a preference. It's really about the fact that millennials happen to be having kids later, and when they do, then they move into the suburbs, and then they buy a car, and then they look very similar to the generations before them. And so there's definitely an age trajectory. I think that there's mounting evidence that there really aren't very many generational differences in terms of preference for car ownership and use. We're going to need something a lot more active in terms of intervention if we want to see these trends change.
So another question deals with whether or not there's been data collection and analysis on the average wait time if you're looking for a ride hail service, either actual or perceived, which can be different. And does that have an impact on, if those data are available, does that show an impact on willingness to give up a car?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So I'm moving here to, this is the collection of all of the implications from the findings that I sort of presented throughout, just so that we can leave that here for people to digest. But I think this really gets at this last point here, which is that this challenge is for us to figure out how we find real alternatives that together can provide value that rivals the car. In our scenarios, we told people to imagine a ride-hailing service that could come and pick them up within very little time and would pretty much be seamless and to be as close to actual private car use as possible. And that's because we really wanted to separate out car ownership and use. How those systems operate today is very far from that. But I think the point here, again, is that even if you were to get a ride-hailing service all the way to that point, car ownership still has a lot of value to people. That what you replace with ride-hailing is the use of the vehicle. It's trip by trip. You want to make that as high quality a service as possible, but then having the car there for you as a security blanket, as a status symbol, as all of these things that make up this value of just owning the car, is still present. And so one of the areas of future research for myself and for many others is going to be unpacking what are the sort of system attributes of a mobility as a service package that would help us get to this cumulative value. And I don't have the answer yet, and I hope that we might.
Yeah, good. So there's a question a little bit different than the discussion so far, looking at the total cost of ownership of different vehicle types. So EVs versus ICE vehicles. Do you have results on that, and how the total cost of ownership is different between those? Does that then have an impact on willingness to accept compensation to give up your vehicle? Or is there a extra pride in owning an EV, say, that affects the equation?
I think that's likely. So right now we're looking at the average across all of our respondents, but our survey did collect the make and model of each respondent's vehicle. And so we are currently in the process of collaborating with some other researchers who have some granular data on the market value. So actually how much do these cars sell for based on make, model, and year, and then where the respondent lives. And I suspect that we will have a very small number of EVs within this sample, and maybe not enough to really do a statistical comparison. But there are other aspects of the vehicle that we could look at in terms of, do people ascribe more value to an American-made car in the United States, right? Is there some patriotism that's ascribed to this, or additional pride that comes from having a car that's made and it's a make and model within the United States, and other aspects. In terms of total cost of ownership, I will again refer to the Insights into Future Mobility report, which does a lot of work looking at internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicle total cost of ownership comparisons, and sort of what we would need to achieve in terms of battery costs under different fuel and electricity prices in order to see those become competitive on a cost basis. Again, I would sort of caution that total cost of ownership is usually done. It is over the average lifetime, but then it talks about just dividing by trips. I think one of the things here that we're talking about is that, again, it's not just the use of the vehicle, it's the ownership of that vehicle. And how do we understand how that total value compares with that cost is going to be something that I think we still need to have within the discussion.
Yeah. So here's an interesting question about impacts of government policies, and I realize that's a really broad category, but the specific question asks, for example, about government subsidies of highways, right? So highway construction, so you can get higher vehicle loads on the highways, as opposed to similar investment in mass transit systems to increase convenience and flexibility of those systems. Do you have a sense or any results that look at impacts of those policy choices on consumer willingness to forego a car?
So yes and no. To really answer the question of does that policy influence car ownership and use, you would really need to look at this over time, right? You would want to have data that tracks over time, and you would have this intervention, and you would somehow have some control, or you would have cities that don't have this policy that look otherwise similar. That's really the only way to tease out that impact from other confounding factors from an experimental perspective. We have cross-sectional data. We only have data at one time period, although we have it across different cities. I think one of the things that we do have is we have the impact of things like how urban is the city, and what do those individuals currently use for their transport. And so what we find is that those who make most of their trips by car are much less willing to give up your car. So if your policy is to implement a car-dependent infrastructure or a car prioritizing infrastructure, if you're going to build highways and roads and neglect public transit, biking, walking facilities, then people are going to use their cars. And that means they need to use their cars. They don't have very good quality alternatives. And then that means they ascribe more value to their car. And we have the opposite, where people who use other modes of travel, presumably because it's there for them, they have the policies have invested in those services and that infrastructure, are more willing to give up their car. And so I think that there are implications that, again, there are some medium-term service and infrastructure improvements and employer benefits that can encourage people to give up their cars, and that long-term land use matters. But we don't have the longitudinal data to really, or it wasn't really the focus of this study, to understand what the impact specifically of the policy was.
Yeah, okay. So we only have a couple of minutes left, and so I saved the hardest question for last. This is a question where the questioner wants help with his mother-in-law. Could be her. She may want her help with a mother-in-law. And the question deals with starts off with question about differences in large metropolitan areas. You talked a little bit about this. So, say areas like Houston or Los Angeles that are large metropolitan areas, but they're sprawled out, very low density, relatively low density, versus more dense areas like Boston or Austin. And question is whether or not you can compare the cost of car ownership and the ability to drive independently in those areas. Is there a way to help the mother-in-law understand the value of giving up a car in one of those areas, and is it different in those areas?
Yeah, so
I think this may be somebody who lives in Austin, but I don't know.
Yeah, this is a question I get fairly often, is sort of, how do we convince people to give up their car? And I want to push back on that entire framing of the question. That if you want someone to switch, you need to give them a quality alternative. We don't want to be restricting people's mobility and ability to access things. If the car is the mode that gives them the best value, then it gives them the best value and they're going to choose it. And that is a perfectly rational decision, even if it costs them $9,200 a year, right? Yes, the costs are expensive, but people derive more value, and a lot of it is intangible, things that we don't usually monetize. And that was sort of the impetus for this project, is we can put a number to it. And we can say, people do value the car more than it costs. And until we can provide them with an alternative that gives them value equivalent to that gives them the mobility that they need at a comfort level that they need, they're not going to switch. And that's a perfectly rational choice. And there are intangible things that could provide, that we could speak to and use to create value in the alternatives that we provide in our urban mobility systems. And that could be connecting public transit, walking and biking with public health, with environmental impacts, with reduced emissions, reduced greenhouse gases, and climate change impacts. And those are things that we could start to build a case for the value of alternatives But we need to be thinking, I mean, I personally think we need to be thinking about building the value of alternatives, not trying to call people irrational for valuing the car as it is now, because we've built a system that makes the car the rational choice.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that answer and for all the answers. As always, you show an amazing grasp of this broad and complicated area. So it's a real treat to have you on to share your expertise and knowledge with the audience. So let me thank you once again for doing this. And I know the audience joins me in thanking you. Thank you to the audience for taking part in this. It's great to have you on and have your questions submitted. I know we didn't get to all of them, but hope we got a reasonable cross section so that you got something answered that you wanted. So thank you again, and look forward to seeing you at a future Mighty event.
Thank you all.
Have a good evening.